Sergei Volkov arrived at the site in late October, when the polar night had already begun to engulf the Kola Peninsula. An Mi-8 helicopter dropped him off on a concrete pad next to a complex of grey buildings surrounded by barbed wire and observation towers. Shaft number 13 was located 90 kilometers from the nearest village, and its existence was not noted on any civilian map. Volkov was handed a folder with protocols, 15 pages of technical data on drilling operations at a depth of 8,700 meters. The last entry was dated October 14th. After that, there were only blank lines. The site's commander, Colonel Gruzdev, met him in the administrative building and immediately led him to the acoustic lab, without giving him time to settle in. Gruzdev spoke quickly, without pauses, as if rehearsing his lines. He explained that at the 8,692-meter mark, the drill bit encountered resistance incompatible with the crystalline rock. A scan revealed an irregularly shaped cavity measuring approximately 3 by 4 meters. Inside it was a rectangular object, the density of which corresponded to steel or titanium. Volkov listened and felt the cold penetrate his protective clothing. The heating in the building was intermittent. Kirill Ossikin, an acoustic systems technician, was waiting for him in the lab, a thin man with fingers yellowed from nicotine. Ossikin turned on the tape recorder and played a recording made 3 days earlier. At first, there was only noise, the hum of the drill, the grinding of rock, hydraulic shocks. Then, at 43 seconds, another sound rose from the depths. A human voice. Not a word, not a scream, a drawn-out groan, turning into a rhythmic muttering. Volkov asked for the fragment to be repeated. Ossikin rewound the tape. The voice sounded again, and now Volkov could discern a structure. It wasn't a random vibration, but a modulated signal, similar to speech but without distinguishable phonemes. Gruzdev demanded a conclusion within 24 hours. Volkov knew that any report indicating an anomaly of biological or artificial origin would trigger the mine's closure. 12 years of work, millions of rubles in funding, the entire deep drilling program, it would all be terminated by a single document. He asked for 24 hours for additional analysis and permission to lower a new set of sensors into the shaft. Gruzdev agreed, but added that Moscow was awaiting an explanation, and if one wasn't forthcoming, the facility would be closed until spring. Volkov signed the equipment release, knowing he had already made his decision. He would find a rational explanation, even if he had to ignore some of the data. The lowering of the sensors took 18 hours. Volkov was in the control room, monitoring the depth gauge. Every meter was marked in red on the digital display. At a depth of 8,000 meters, the rock temperature reached 220 degrees Celsius, and the pressure exceeded 2,000 atmospheres. The equipment was operating at the limits of its permissible parameters. When the cable reached the 8,692 mark, Volkov gave the command to stop the descent and activate the scanners. The first images arrived 40 minutes later. A structure appeared on the oscilloscope screen, smooth lines, right angles, a symmetrical shape. A metal door, embedded in granite rock. The door was about 15 centimeters thick. The material was dense, uniform, and free of corrosion. Volkov initiated a thermographic scan. The temperature outside the door was 30 degrees lower than the surrounding rock. A temperature gradient existed within the cavity, inexplicable without thermal insulation or active cooling. Ossikin turned on the sound system. Microphones lowered to the door began transmitting sound. At first, silence, then a slight hum, similar to ventilation. And 2 minutes later, voices. Not one, but several. They spoke simultaneously, interrupting each other, but without any intonation of argument or panic. Volkov recorded everything on a tape recorder, making notes in a journal. Ossekin attempted to isolate individual words using frequency filters, but the results were inconsistent. The speech sounded Russian, but the phonetic structure didn't match any dialect. Gruzdev arrived in the control room an hour after the recording began. He listened to the report and demanded that the experiment be stopped. Volkov objected, citing the need for a full analysis before drawing a conclusion. Gruzdev raised his voice, reminding them of the chain of command and the deadline. Volkov insisted on continuing the observation for another 12 hours. Gruzdev left, slamming the door. At 3 in the morning, the voices changed. They became louder and clearer, as if they were approaching the microphones. Ossekin noticed that the frequency spectrum of the signal began to match the frequencies at which the sensors were operating. Volkov hypothesized resonance, but the math didn't add up. Such an effect required feedback, adapting the source to the receiver's characteristics. He ordered Ossekin to turn off the sensors. Ossekin complied. 10 seconds later, the voices ceased. In the morning, the younger one disappeared. Technician Andrei Lapin. He descended to the drilling platform on the 8th tier of the shaft to replace a cable. Communication was lost 37 minutes into the descent. A search party found his helmet at the edge of the platform. His body was never found. The accident was recorded as a fall into the shaft. Volkov prohibited further personnel descents until the acoustic data analysis was completed. Gruzdev countermanded his order and ordered drilling to resume. Moscow demanded that the 9,000-meter mark be passed by the end of November. Volkov wrote a memo demanding that work be suspended due to unspecified risks. Gruzdev tore up the memo and summoned him to his office. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Gruzdev explained that shaft number 13 was not a scientific facility, but a military one. The real goal of the program was not to study the Earth's crust, but to search for underground cavities suitable for the placement of strategic assets. The anomaly at a depth of 8,000 meters has already been recorded in the reports, and the Moscow Commission will decide on further action. Until then, Volkov's task is to ensure the technical feasibility of continuing the work. Any delay will be considered sabotage. Volkov returned to the control room and discovered that Ossekin had independently initiated a rescan. A new image appeared on the screen. The door remained in place, but a second structure had appeared next to it, a vertical crack about 5 centimeters wide, extending through the rock to a depth of more than 10 meters. Ossekin explained that the crack had appeared within the last 6 hours. Volkov checked the data. The geological sensors had recorded no seismic activity, temperature changes, or rock movements. That evening, the voices resumed without the sound system being turned on. They were heard in the control room itself, quiet but audible, coming from the speakers of the disconnected equipment. Ossekin attempted to localize the source, but the sound was transmitted through the entire electrical system of the facility. Volkov ordered the power to the laboratory shut off. The voices stopped for 3 minutes, then returned, this time coming from the ventilation shafts. That night, Gruzdev ordered drilling deeper from the discovered door. Volkov learned of this when the drilling rig was already operating. He descended to the upper tier of the shaft and demanded that the process be stopped. The foreman refused, citing a direct order from the colonel. Volkov climbed back up and tried to contact Gruzdev on the intercom. The line was down. All the lines were busy with outgoing calls to Moscow. 2 hours later, the drill bit broke through a layer of rock and entered the cavity behind the door. The pressure in the shaft dropped sharply. A stream of air with a temperature of -40 degrees Celsius rose from the depths. The foreman managed to sound the alarm before the line was completely cut off. Volkov monitored the instruments. All sensors below 8,000 meters had stopped transmitting data. By morning, communication with the lower levels had not been restored. Gruzdev convened an emergency meeting, attended by Volkov, Chief Engineer Rakitin, Security Chief Zotov, and Dr. Stepanyan. Gruzdev announced that 3 members of the drilling crew were missing, and 2 more were in the infirmary with frostbite and symptoms of hypoxia. Rakitin proposed sealing the shaft with concrete and evacuating the facility. Zotov supported this. Volkov objected, claiming that without understanding the nature of the anomaly, mothballing it could be more dangerous than continuing the research. Gruzdev ordered Volkov and Ossekin to descend to the 8th level with portable equipment to restore communication with the sensors. Volkov attempted to refuse, but Gruzdev reminded him of his criminal record for shirking official duties in a restricted facility. Volkov and Ossekin were given protective suits and oxygen tanks and descended into the cages along the main shaft. On the 8th level, the temperature hovered around 0 degrees Celsius. The shaft walls were covered with frost. Ossekin deployed the equipment and attempted to activate the backup communication channel. The sensors responded. Camera feeds began streaming onto the portable monitor. Volkov saw a drilling platform at a depth of 8,700 meters. The rig stood motionless. 3 figures in protective clothing lay next to it. Ossekin zoomed in. The figures lay on their backs, arms outstretched, faces turned upward. Volkov ordered the camera to focus on the door. The door was open. Beyond it lay a cavity, illuminated by the flickering light of the drilling rig's emergency lights. Inside were metal structures, racks, control panels, and vertical cylinders about 2 meters high. On the racks lay objects resembling tools or equipment samples. Indicators glowed on the panels. Volkov recognized the structure. It was Soviet industrial equipment from the mid-1960s. Ossekin directed the camera deeper into the cavity. At the far end of the room was a second door, more massive, with a handwheel locking mechanism. There was a man standing next to the door. He was dressed in a white protective suit without. The suit was clean and undamaged. The figure stood motionless, facing the camera. Volkov asked Ossekin to zoom in. The suit's helmet had no visor. Instead, it had a smooth metal plate. The figure began to move. It approached the rack, picked up one of the objects, a cylindrical container, and turned back to the camera. Then it lifted the container, as if displaying it. Volkov felt Ossekin grab his shoulder. The screen displayed the words written in white on the side of the container. Shaft number 13. Sample 14. October 1979. The connection was lost. All the instruments shut down simultaneously. Volkov and Ossekin were left in darkness, illuminated only by the emergency lights on their helmets. A sound came from deep within the shaft, slow, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on a metal ladder. Volkov ordered them to ascend. They reached the cage and gave the signal to lift. The winch started working. When the cage passed the 7th tier mark, Osikin turned and looked down. Volkov heard him exhale a single word: lifting. The facility was evacuated 48 hours later. All personnel were flown by helicopter to Murmansk, from where they were sent by train to Moscow. Volkov was placed in a closed medical isolation ward on Lubyanka Square, where he spent 6 weeks under the observation of psychiatrists and special department officers. He was interrogated daily, demanding a detailed description of all his observations. Volkov recounted everything he remembered, and each time received the same answer. His testimony contradicted the laws of physics and would be excluded from the record. In January 1981, he was given a transfer document to the position of senior engineer at the Norilsk mining and metallurgical plant, with a lower security clearance. Along with the document was a non-disclosure agreement containing a list of topics whose mention was considered treason. Shaft number 13 was not on the list. Instead, it read participation in special operations at facilities on the Kola Peninsula. Volkov served in Norilsk for 11 years. He married, had a daughter, received an apartment, and earned the title of Veteran of Labor. In the evenings, he sometimes listened to the radio, tuning the receiver to shortwave frequencies. One day, in March of 1989, he heard voices through the static, the same ones that had been heard in the control room of shaft number 13. They were uttering numbers, coordinates, depths, dates. Volkov wrote them down on a piece of paper and then burned the notes in an ashtray. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some defense program documents were declassified. Volkov found a brief summary of shaft number 13 in the archives. The facility had been mothballed in November 1979 due to depleted funding, the shaft flooded, and the equipment dismantled. The site's coordinates matched what he remembered. Volkov sent a request to the Ministry of Geology archives for technical documentation. A reply arrived 4 months later. The requested materials had been destroyed in a fire in a departmental storage facility in 1983. He never found Osikina. Officially, the technician died of a heart attack in December 1979 and was buried in Murmansk. Volkov went to the cemetery and found the grave. The date of death was inscribed on the monument, December 23. That was the day they had both emerged from the mine. In 2005, Volkov retired and moved to Petrozavodsk. He bought a shortwave radio scanner and tuned it to geological service frequencies every night. Occasionally, very rarely, voices would break through the static. They no longer spoke Russian. They didn't speak any known language. But Volkov recognized the rhythm, the structure, the intonation. He recorded them on a tape recorder and kept the tapes in an old metal box under his bed. When the box was full, he threw out half the recordings, keeping only the clearest. His daughter visited him twice a year. One day, she asked what the recordings were about. Volkov replied that they were material for a book of memoirs. She didn't ask again. In 2012, an article appeared online about the resumption of deep well drilling on the Kola Peninsula, a new program, modern equipment, international cooperation. The article mentioned an old mothballed mine that was planned to be used as the foundation for a new shaft. The facility's number was not given, but the coordinates matched. Volkov wrote a letter to the editors of the scientific journal that published the article. The letter was returned marked addressee unknown. On the night of October 27, 2012, the radio scanner picked up a signal on a frequency Volkov hadn't used for 20 years. The voices were loud and clear. They counted down from 100 to 0. When they finished counting, the voices fell silent. Volkov turned off the radio and went to bed. In the morning, he was awakened by a phone call. It was his daughter. She reported that a magnitude 4 earthquake had struck the KOLA Peninsula overnight. The epicenter was located at a depth of 9 kilometers. Volkov thanked her for the information and hung up. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray sky over Petrozavodsk. Then he returned to his desk, took a blank sheet of paper from a drawer, and began writing his report, the very one he hadn't written 33 years ago.